is Zooey Diggory, and I'm a riparian ecologist in Stillwater Sciences. And Stillwater is working for the Flood Control District of Maricopa County to develop a vegetation management plan for the El Rio reach of the Gila River. Am I going in and out here with the microphone? That just means. Okay, darn, because I'm going to be looking at parallel. So the El Rio reach is a 17-mile reach of the Gila River. It's about 40 minutes outside of Phoenix. Our planning area, or our study reach that I'll be referring today, is about 8,000 acres. And this photograph here gives you a pretty good sense of what this reach looks like, at least in the downstream end. We've got the Gila River running down the middle, which is actually standing water at this location. And then we've got a nice big wide floodway, both the north and south of the channel. And then outside that floodway, and most of the reach is agricultural land. I want to take a second to acknowledge my co-authors from Stillwater and also from the Flood Control District. And then over on the right-hand side, I want to give a little shout-out to our Technical Advisory Committee. Several of these people are here at this conference, and they've been providing some really great input. So first and foremost, this vegetation management plan has to reduce the risk of flooding through the removal of saltcedar. This reach has become so choked with saltcedar that the high flows are now predicted to flood adjacent agricultural lands. And these agricultural lands are anticipated to be developed with houses and commercial buildings pretty soon. So there lies the rub really with this project. We also, another objective of the plan is to maintain and enhance native habitat. We've got some threatened and endangered species with potential habitat here and other native wildlife. This is going to be a long-term plan, so we need to be accounting for future changes in this reach. And that includes things like climate change, which is going to influence what plant species can persist here. That also means, of course, water use changes, land use changes as this valley becomes developed. And of course the arrival of the tamarack beetle, which is expected to result in the defoliation and mortality of a lot of the saltcedar. And then of course for vegetation management on this kind of scale to be feasible, it also has to be sustainable and as low maintenance as possible. So we felt like this plan really, to meet those goals and objectives, we really had to have a strong scientific foundation. So we developed that by compiling and collecting a lot of, we call it here, biophysical data. So this included things like LIDAR-derived topography and canopy height, and that was actually really critical to a lot of our large-scale planning without LIDAR data. But we also were compiling climate information, and just so you guys know, it's getting hotter. We compiled a lot of hydrology and geomorphology information, collected some soil samples, looked at groundwater levels, did vegetation mapping and surveys, compiled wildlife habitat information, and looked at land use patterns. So these biophysical data and information had a lot of implications, obviously, for this plan. I'm going to run through some of the key ones. The first one is that the hydrology in this reach is episodic. The channel is very dynamic. And up in this top part, this top map has what we refer to as the flood reset zone mapped in red. And this is where the channel tends to change the most during high flow events. So activities that occur in this area are at higher risk of flood scour and deposition, things like that. The NRCS soil mapping and then our soil sampling fortunately indicates that overall soils look like they're within the range that native riparian species should tolerate. And this bottom map shows our relative elevation map. This is again from the LIDAR data. It's just the elevation of the land relative to the river channel. And when we compared this to those groundwater levels that we had, we found a nice relationship between relative elevation and depth to groundwater. So we used this relative elevation map as a proxy for groundwater depth, which was harder to measure. In terms of vegetation, this upper map is just a snippet from our vegetation map. And that bright kind of limey green is all saltcedar. So you can see that there is a lot of it. And this is actually one of our more diverse sections of the river. So we're making it look a little nicer than it actually is here. One thing that we saw was pretty much no natural recruitment. And so the implication there is that once salt cedar is gone, it's not like we're going to end up with these desirable vegetation conditions. We're going to have to do some active planting. We did find some nice remnant stands and some native vegetation, which I point out in this map. We have some strands of cottonwood and willow that are still left. We have in gold these kind of interesting assemblages of native desert shrubs. We have some marsh vegetation, which tends to hang out right in the river channel. And then not shown on this map, we also have some remnant stands of mesquite, BOSQUE, and Palo Verde vegetation. We were able to look at our vegetation samples and that relative elevation data and get some relationships between relative elevation and different native plant species. And we use those relationships when we move forward when I talk about this in the rest of the presentation about where we thought different plants would persist. It's based on these relationships that we established in the field. And it's also important to point out that this reach provides some important avian habitat in particular. There's potential habitat for southwestern willow flycatcher, western yellow-billed cuckoo, and there's also have been clapper rail sightings here. So we have to be very conscientious about making sure that the habitat for these species is not reduced from salt cedar removal. So we took all of those, that biophysical information, and we turned it into criteria that we could use in a GIS to determine what vegetation management activities should be appropriate and sustainable in specific areas in this reach. And this is what we ended up with. This is a little snapshot of our vegetation plan map in the very lowest part of the planning reach. So you'll see these. So we've got different unit types and different colors. And there's a couple things that we'll see on the next few slides that I want to point out so you have some understanding of these maps. Most of them are facing north. The river is flowing to your left. The dotted line here is that flood reset zone that I showed in the earlier slide in red. And every once in a while, you'll see a little white dot. That's an agricultural return flow or some sort of treated wastewater that's coming into the system. And we see a lot of robust native vegetation at those locations. So we ended up with 5 primary treatment types, or treatment units is what I call them. And so I'll run through those. Our first treatment type is also our most boring. It's the no action unit type, and this is shown in gray in this map. And these are simply where there is little to no saltpeter, and so removing it should have little to no effect on reducing flood risk. We are recommending that these areas continue to be monitored periodically to see if saltpeter starts becoming more established in these areas. But overall, we have the sense that these areas are so dry that they can't support even saltpeter. This unit type makes up about 36% of our planning reach. The next unit type is a saltpeter treatment only. So these are areas where there's at least 30% relative cover of native vegetation. And the idea is that once we start getting rid of saltpeter, there should be enough natives there to naturally recruit and colonize at least the local area. To help make sure that that would actually be the case, we've screened these units for natural recruitment potential. So we've only included areas that have a close proximity to water, low relative elevations, high canopy cover or high canopy heights, which we use as a proxy for productivity, and non-saline soils. And these make up, I think, 7% of our planning reach, which is a very small percentage and is indicative of how little native vegetation is persisting. So getting a little increasingly interesting here. Our next one is the riparian enhancement units. And those are areas where there's very dense saltpeter, but we have a low enough relative elevation or close enough proximity to water that we should be able to support native riparian cottonwood and willow forests. And these are shown in the bright blue in this map. This particular type offers one of our greatest opportunities for offsetting impacts to wildlife habitat from salt cedar removal. So these would be areas that would need to be planted densely. They would have, multiple canopy layers with herbaceous shrub and tree layers. And so we're really not expecting to see any flood risk reduction associated with this particular unit, but it is valuable to the overall plan nonetheless. And this makes up about 13% of our plan reach. The next one is desert shrub enhancement. These are also areas, and this is shown in gold on this map. These are, again, very dense salt cedar that would need to be removed, but these are not areas where we're expecting riparian vegetation to be able to persist. We're just simply too far from water. And so in these areas, they would be planted with native desert shrubs, so things like atriplex, creosote, rabbit brush. And because those plants are so much smaller than salt cedar, and because they would be planted, if we want to mirror the conditions that are there now, we'd be planting them quite sparsely. So this really offers our greatest opportunity for reducing flood risk. And these make up 36% of our planning reach. The last type that I'll talk about is the mesquite bosque enhancement units. And these are actually areas that are quite similar to where desert scrub enhancement would occur, but they are up on tributary terraces and also in less flood-prone areas. These would be areas where once salt cedar is removed, we'd be planting mesquite, palo verdes, and associated shrub and herbaceous species. This is another unit type that could be used to help offset the impacts of salt cedar removal, particularly for migratory nesting birds and for western yellow-billed cuckoo. They'd be probably too far from water for southwestern viticulture. And these make up about 8% of the planning reach right now. So I've shown you all of these little pieces of this puzzle, but what are they all going to look like when they get put together? And what is this reach going to look like once this vegetation management plan is implemented? So to give you a sense of that, I want to walk you through what the corridor looks like now. This is our cross-section from our floodway. And because it is so wide, this cross-section is actually broken up into 4 parts. So here's our left bank, and here's our right bank over here. So in this example, which is actually taken from a real place in this river, we have a gravel mining pit that's lined with salt cedar. We have the low-flow channel that has is lucky enough to have a few continent wood and willows stuck in amongst salt cedar. And we've got really dense salt cedar, a cobble bar, lots and lots of salt cedar, and some more salt cedar here. And then farther away from the channel, we've got some native desert shrubs, more salt cedar. And then back here, this cross-section is also fortunate enough to have some remnant mesquite vegetation. And then finally, at the landward edge, we've got an irrigation canal. So that's what it looks like now. And here's what we think it might look like in the future. So it looks pretty different. And we're freaking some people out, but we'll talk about that. So again, walking from the left bank to the right bank, now we've got a gravel mining pit with the edges have been graded so that we can support some marsh vegetation or Umaquappa rail. Instead of salt cedar, we've got mesquite. Along our low-flow channel, we have riparian forest with cottonwoods and willows. We still have that open cobble bar over here, which was designated as one of those no-action units. We have low relative elevation over here, so we've got some more riparian cottonwood and willow forest. And then as the relative elevation increases, we've got desert shrubs, lots more desert shrubs where that salt cedar was. And then back here along the landward edge of the cross-section, we've got mesquite bosque vegetation. So this looks pretty different. There we go. Now, in the future. So one of our major challenges is the loss of habitat structure associated with this amount of removal of salt cedar. So some of the ways that we're trying to address that is by really maximizing where we can support those cottonwood and willow cuttings. So any place where we think that there's going to be enough water, that's what we want to plant there. We're also trying to maximize the amount of mesquite bosque vegetation that we can enhance and not conflict with that flood reduction goal. But I think it's also important to note when we're thinking about the loss of habitat structure that this is probably pretty close to what native vegetation looked like historically in this reach before it was invaded by salt cedar. And that's certainly what those sort of remnant patches of native vegetation is suggesting to us. Also, I think it's important that we consider what this cross-section would look like once the leaf beetle arrives. So we would end up with none of that green and a lot of that biomass still left. So we'd still have the flood risk problem. But another way I think that will be very critical to ensuring that we're not having a significant loss of habitat for wildlife is by what will essentially be the incremental implementation of this plan. So you can't do vegetation management on the scale in one fell swoop, and it will be implemented in a series of individual projects. So outlines that process. We've got to identify parcels and landowners that want to be a part of this project. We have to evaluate those sites for opportunities and constraints. We need to get funding, and we need to get permits. We need to do the implementation and the monitoring, and then we need to do that all over again for 40-acre or so sort of parcels. So through that implementation process, we'll have patches of habitat loss, but it won't be large scale. We'll also have some time for the native vegetation to get established before the next salt cedar removal parcel takes place. In the vegetation management plan, we'll be providing recommendations and considerations for a variety of implementation-related issues. So these will include, and I think a lot of this information is going to stem from a lot of the research that we've been hearing about and good work that we've been hearing about at this conference. So for example, there'll be recommendations about what to include in individual site assessments. Things like baseline vegetation surveys, baseline wildlife surveys. There'll be information about funding sources and rough cost estimates, information about permitting and regulatory compliance, recommendations for site preparation activities. These could be things like inoculating the soils before planting, but also could include excavating sort of swale features in some areas where we can start getting closer, shorter distances to groundwater and increase the amount of area where we can support cottonwoods and willows. We'll have some information about the salt cedar removal and treatment methods that we think are most appropriate for this reach. Recommendations for native planting propagation and planting. So these are, what species do we think are going to be essential to creating the desired habitat conditions? What species should be considered for enhancing pollinator habitat? And the use of different genotypes to ensure that these plantings are successful in the future. In terms of maintenance, we're anticipating that there'll be at least 3 to 5 years of salt cedar resprout treatment. And then, of course, we're making recommendations for monitoring, which will be the bare minimum that may be needed for regulatory compliance, but will also ideally include experimental plots and long-term monitoring of wildlife and vegetation. So we have been incorporating the input from that technical advisory committee. The maps that you saw are actually being hydraulically modeled right now to see how close we are to our flood risk reduction target. Initial signs are that is good, but we probably will be making some revisions to some of those units. And then once the plan is finalized, there'll be outreach to landowners to identify projects. And the district is planning on doing some programmatic permitting for this and developing resources that can be used by individual projects for regulatory compliance. And that's about it. Let me know if you have any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Zoe. We have time for several questions. All right, this gentleman, and then I saw Pat, and we'll see who else.
Thanks. I'm not sure if you've gotten to this level of detail, but have you thought about transitioning from the treatment to the planting and how the residual herbicides might affect the planting? Are you down to that level yet?
We're not, but that's that last slide where I talked about the things that we're going to be recommending and sort of making considerations for when we get into implementation. That's exactly where we'd be talking about those sorts of things. And specifically about what are the pros and cons of different salt cedar removal and treatment methods. Some would leave residual herbicide that we would have to be concerned with, and that there would be an offset in timing in terms of when planting would occur. So that detail will be sort of minimally addressed in this plan.
I was wondering if you have information on the sort of, in recent decades, the frequency of flood events that cause any kind of geomorphic change in that reach. It seems like the planning is sort of assuming static topography, and I'm just curious to know to what extent those kinds of changes are sort of anticipated and maybe incorporated into your planning process.
I'm glad that you asked that, because I cut all that stuff out in order to get to 20 minutes. But we have been thinking about and incorporating that quite a bit. So that initial slide had just the little red lines of the flood reset zone, but that is essentially looking at, okay, when we have high flow events, where is the channel changing the most? And in those unit maps, you saw the little dotted lines of where the flood reset zone is occurring. And so throughout the plan, we're sort of acknowledging, hey, there is a lot of risk to whatever we do between those dotted lines in this flood reset zone. And we're coming up with a few different strategies to address that. And one of them is this, what we're calling it a hydraulic shield. And it's essentially a conserved patch of saltcedar upstream. So that if you've done some plantings in this sort of high-risk area, you'd have a little bit of insurance by this upstream vegetation protecting those areas. But that will be, because we are so, we don't have enough water, we really can't afford to not work in this high-risk area. It's where all the water is right now. And so if we excluded those areas, there would be almost no place to do cottonwood and willows. So we're sort of left with having to do them in a high-risk area and implement some upstream measures to help protect them.
We have time for one more question. Don't be shy. All right.
Maybe you mentioned this and I just missed it, but not being a hydrologist, what's the mechanism through which removal of tamarisk would reduce the flood risk?
Just getting rid of the biomass. So right now there is, what's the word, hydraulic roughness. That is the problem, right? So we have water is coming into this reach and is just piling up behind the wood in the saltcedar. So it's the trunks and the branches of the saltcedar that are impeding flows, and then those flows, as they back up, start to creep up and out onto the agricultural land. So a lot of what we're talking about in the desert shrub, why that becomes such an important component to reducing flood risk, is those shrubs are very small. They're not woody like like saltcedar is, and they will, sort of fall over or go away when the flood flows come through and not back up water. So, and that's also part of why cottonwood plantings and mesquite plantings are not expected to result in a flood risk benefit, because they have that woody material that is going to pile up water behind it as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Zooey.